it's Joe Partavila, and when I was a kid, I thought retirement life was living in an old folks' home and then being rejuvenated by an alien life force. But it turns out that was just the movie Cocoon. So what does retirement look like today? Joining me today are Patti and Milledge Hart, the authors of the forthcoming book, The Resolutionist. Welcome to the anti-retirement movement. Hello, Patti.
Hi, Joe. How are you today?
Good, and Milledge, thanks for joining me today.
It's great to be here, Joe.
First and foremost, Patti, this is a movement. Now, I speak to a lot of authors, business people, but rarely do I get a chance to speak to someone who's starting a movement. Tell us how this movement started.
I think the movement started with Milledge and I spending our own time thinking about how we wanted to spend our life after we were done with our full-time work. And through that process, really finding ourselves in communities of others that were also going through the process. And I think we all know that retirement, really is no longer about growing old. It's really about living a long and fulfilled life. The movement started with everyone kind of sharing with us their journeys and their challenges and what they would like to really aspire to at this stage of life. Nobody has given up, right? People don't give up when the clock turns and your age changes by 1 year. You don't give up on your hopes and dreams. As a matter of fact, now you have more time and energy to apply to them.
And Milledge, are people retiring later than they used to? Because I remember back in the day, people like 60, 65, they're like, all right, I'm done. Are people waiting a little longer? Are they just sort of still doing the same thing where they wait to their mid-60s to retire?
I think they're continuing to retire at around the same time. I think the most interesting fact that we've learned in this journey, Joe, was over the last 100 years, we've added 30 years to our lifespan. When Patti and I realized that fact, knowing that we'd left full-time work, we realized we had to do things differently and think about things differently and try to make this phase of our life the best phase of our life. And so that 30 extra years in the, post-work phase is a daunting amount of time, but it's a wonderful amount of time to do what has always been on your list or things that you're passionate about.
And Patti, what does it mean to be a resolutionist?
A resolutionist is really someone who's decided to leave the traditional full-time work behind. That doesn't mean that you're not engaged or generating income for yourself or whatever, but that you've left it behind, but you haven't stopped really applying energy. You haven't stopped wanting to learn. You haven't stopped wanting to adventure and contribute. So that, there are a lot of different paths you can choose when you get to this point in your life. But the resolutionist path is one that says, I'm not finished. As a matter of fact, in some ways, I'm just starting.
Huh. And Milledge, it's funny, in this day and age, it's almost like the perfect time to be a resolutionist because of the gig economy. You may retire from your career that you were doing 20, 30 years, but then you could be like, oh, I could do certain gigs. I can do, I could do freelance writing. I can do data entry. You can do all these things now that probably 20, 30 years ago would have been a little harder.
That's exactly right. You have so many more opportunities, especially with technology and remote work, to do all kinds of different things. And not only from a work perspective, but also from a perspective of things that you've put off while you were working full time, whether it's learning the guitar or learning a language or contributing to a charity or joining the board of a charity. It gives you a lot of opportunity to have a portfolio of things that occupy your time and keep you engaged.
Patti, what have you and Milledge done as resolutionists yourselves?
Oh, I think, we're just starting. So, I think that's the great part of being resolutionist, right? Is that the list kind of never gets smaller. It always gets longer. So, in our book, we share 12 resolutions, not all of which will be appropriate for everyone, but 12 just things to stimulate your thinking on how you would transition. And our first one is called Rip the Band-Aid Off. And it really is about creating a dramatic change in your life from what you did historically. A lot of people retire and they keep going to the same places for lunch and stopping by the old office and reading old publications from their old industry. And one of our suggestions is to rip the Band-Aid off and create a trajectory that looks different in your life. And so our Band-Aid that we ripped off as we relocated to London, kind of within days, I think, of the last, when I packed up my my office, my box with all my personal belongings from my office. We moved to London and really traveled and experienced a new place and a new life, and learned things that, really went on a journey and adventure together. So that was one big thing. But there's a lot of other things. We've really both become immersed in the world of philanthropy. We really didn't understand, how to set up a foundation for ourselves and our son. We didn't, we really had to go to school on this in the same way we did, I guess, when we were 20 years old at university. We had to learn how to be good philanthropers. We didn't understand that. So I would say the list is very long and distinguished of the things we've done. Some of them very simple, like Milledge wanted to bungee jump. And so, he went and did that. I wanted to embrace yoga and meditation. So I've done that. So there's small things and large things, but I think the 12 resolutions give you a nice menu to select what you think works best for you.
Cool. Milledge, let's step back a second. London, how did that happen? You guys don't have you have English accents. So what made you guys choose London?
About a decade before, we'd spent a year in Paris, which we had loved. And just going to Paris, the two of us, without knowing anyone, had dramatically changed our life. And so as we were exiting the work world, we thought, where in the world do we want to live? And where do we want to go have a unique experience together? And so we went through, a long list of possibilities. But London, we'd both been there a ton on business, and it really resonated as a place we could go, spend time, and it would feel like home. So we moved to London, and while we were in London for a 2-year time frame, I think we traveled to 40 different countries and saw every bit of entertainment in London, and met a bunch of new friends, and just really had a terrific rip the Band-Aid off moment.
That's great. And so let's talk about living a life of a resolutionist, because, obviously when you get to a certain age, whether it's, late 50s, 60s, whatever age you want to talk about, you still have children and family. So how do you balance and this could be a question for you, Patti, how do you balance the resolutionist life with still maintaining that family life where you could have maybe adult children still living with you, or maybe you're still supporting them financially? Tell us about that balance.
Yeah, well, I think it's one of the greatest things, honestly, about being a resolutionist is, your most valuable asset at this time in your life is time. For many of us who were working and climbing the corporate ladder, one of the biggest sacrifices you make is family time. I mean, when you're traveling for your work, or you're working late hours, or you're getting ready for an investor meeting. And so now is the great payback, I call it, with my son, my great opportunity to pay him back for all the sacrifices he made. So I don't think it's a balance. I think it's an integral part of being a resolutionist. And you mentioned children and adult children, but also parents. I mean, most resolutionists, if they're retiring 55 to 65, have living parents. Having that opportunity to spend quality time with your parents, probably for the first time ever, is a wonderful part of this stage of life. So I don't think it's balance. I think it's all part of the plan, is to say, I think one of the stories we tell, which we think is fascinating in the book, is some friends of ours who are recent resolutionists set a lifetime goal of taking all of their grandchildren on an African safari when they graduate from high school. And we thought, well, that's an interesting goal. And they said, well, it really forces you to manage your financial situation so you can afford to do it, manage your health so that you're able to accompany them on the trip, and manage the relationship you have with your children and grandchildren so they'll actually want to come and spend time with you. So it was manifesting itself and saying, actually, we're setting this goal for ourselves, but it really is a family journey.
And Joe, if I can add, and just to brag about my stepson, Dustin, he is an amazing individual. He is, and his husband is delightful. And they are always up for whatever adventure we could possibly come up with. And so us living in London, they saw as a great opportunity to learn about a different part of the world. And they're amazing travel partners. So we're incredibly fortunate that they were old enough and interested enough to go and live that journey with us.
And so let's talk about your lives pre-resolutionist. Patti, what were you, I mean, I know you sort of dip your toes in a lot of things, but how did your life leading up to, your quote unquote retirement age prepare you to be a resolutionist?
Well, I actually made an attempt at being a resolutionist earlier in my life and failed, to be honest. So I did step back about 10 years before this most recent time with the intention of, moving into portfolio life and, not being wed to one career. And it didn't work out. And it didn't work out because I didn't plan for it, honestly. It just kind of happened. And then I was in it. And all of these things that I think are critically important to being a successful resolutionist, one of them being to develop a new metric system for yourself. I mean, all of us who have been earning a living have had metric systems. In many cases, they're provided by others, right? And designed by others. So maybe it's, your sales quota, or it's your stock price, or it's your whatever your metric system is. It's very well defined, and that's how you feel good about yourself because you're marching towards it. And I think the day after you leave full-time work, the metric system is not provided for you anymore. In many cases, it's not obvious. I think the life, leading up to my decision to become a resolutionist, there were a lot of tools and elements there. It's just not as natural to apply them in this stage of life. So really focusing myself on what are the things that allowed me to be a confident, contributing member of society before I was retired. How do I apply those in this phase of my life? That was really, so I tried it once, I guess, trial and error, I guess is what I would say about that first time. And I learned from it by saying to myself, the next time you have to have a plan, just like you have a plan for everything else in your life. You can't just think it's going to happen on its own.
Milledge, how obviously you and Patti are sort of like a one person kind of thing. You're a couple, but you're merged into one person. How about families that are out there that may want to be resolutionists, but either one of the spouses is still in working life, or maybe there's an age difference? How do you balance being a resolutionist in a home where your partner may not be one?
I think fairly easily, actually. I think anybody can be a resolutionist, whether you're, one of a couple or whether you're, by yourself without a committed relationship. And one of the things that we talk about in the book, or we write about in the book, is being your own best friend. A lot of things, I mean, even in the relationship that we have where Patti and I do most everything together, there's certain things that maybe are more adrenaline focused that Patti's less interested in than I am, like bungee jumping, she mentioned earlier. And so you have to figure out a way to do things that you want to do on your own and be comfortable with that. And whether you're one of a relationship where you're moved on for full-time work and want to be a resolutionist and your partner is still working full-time, or if you're by yourself. So I think anybody can be, but I count my blessings that I have a partner who does it with me.
Yeah. And Joe, I would add that I think in the event you have a partner that is still working full time for whatever reason, I think being a good resolutionist makes you a better partner for them, makes them more supportive, right? I mean, if you continue to be learning and you continue to be adventuresome and you continue to be interesting as a human being, you're going to be a better partner. And again, to go back to our book, we tell one of the stories in the book is about a couple that we know, there is an age difference. He made a decision to go first, and they bought an olive ranch in Italy and moved to it. And she worked kind of remotely. She did some things. It was so much easier for her to not feel guilty about continue working because he was learning the olive business. I think it really is taking the pressure off of your partner to not make them feel guilty that they're not yet retired by continuing to grow and be interesting and interested, and bring it back and share it with them.
And Milledge, what's it like being a resolutionist with Patti, but also starting this movement? Talk to me about that dynamic. Like, obviously you both seem like you're loving resolutionist life, but you're also starting a movement as well. So tell me about that tricky balance.
It's a very good question, Joe. I mean, doing anything with my partner, Patti, is fun and interesting. And one of the reasons why we wrote this book was it was actually a resolution that we wanted to write a book together and partner in doing something like this. And now as it's evolved to more than just a book, to a movement where, we have a number of friends who, are living this exact same life. And there's a number of people around the world living this exact same life. And we're just trying to put a name to it and to give some help to those, or some ideas to those who would like to live a better life than, in retirement.
Yeah, and I think, any movement, Joe, if you look back over history, right, any movement takes mass. I mean, masses are required to drive change through movements. And, this is the prime time for the baby boomers, who have been the leaders in many movements, civil rights movements, women's movements, anti-war movements, a lot of movements. And, it's been a generation that has generated more wealth for themselves than any previous generation. So you have a generation of boomers that by their nature have been creators of movements, right? And change through movements. And so Milledge and I have had this great balance, which has been, I think, terrific, between enjoying our own retirement time, but also spending our time adding fuel to this movement to get it going, whether it's writing our book or, we host salons at our house of fellow resolutionists, speaking. It's amazing how many people are going through this very phase. But I think timing sometimes is everything. And I think with the masses of the baby boomer generation and the wealth that they've created and their focus on health and wellness, it's kind of the perfect time for that kind of energy behind a change.
Patti, what's the financial aspect of being a resolutionist? I mean, do you have to have like a really impressive 401k? Do you have to have a big retirement savings? The idea of resolutionist sounds amazing, and I'm sure anyone 60 plus would love to sort of live that lifestyle. But talk to me about the actual financial aspects of being a resolutionist.
I think it's like every other stage of your life. Your financial resources have to match your dreams and your activities, but it's not something that's only for the wealthy. I think there are plenty of people in our lives who are at a different place financially, but also, your resolutionist dreams and your rip the Band-Aid off. It doesn't have to be go move to London, right? It can be go to a cabin in the woods for a week, or, do a mobile home trip across the United States. I think it's really about matching, as it always is in your life, right? Matching your activities with the financial resources that are available to you. But dreams don't have to always cost money. That's one of the things we find. One of our goals, we go through this goal list process, was to pass a compliment to a stranger every day. It doesn't cost anything, right? But as a resolutionist, I have time to do that now. I didn't have time to do that when I was working. And now I find, whether it's someone in line at the grocery store or it's someone when we're off on a hiking trail, to just pass on a compliment to someone or a thank you to someone doesn't cost money. So I think, again, it's one of the obstacles people think about, that they think all of this is crazy expensive and, I'm not wealthy, so I can't do it. But that's really not the case at all. There's a life of a resolutionist in every socioeconomic category.
And Joe, I would also, to add to what Patti was saying, I would also say anyone, like she just said, can be a resolutionist. But I think even someone who is housebound and doesn't have the ability to travel can be a resolutionist. Because a resolutionist is just coming up with goals and ideas, and it's in your mind, and you can be housebound, but you resolve to be a better person, or resolve to learn something, or resolve to make someone's lives better. And you can do that from any place in the world at any time if you resolve to do it.
So let me ask you something. Can you prepare to be a resolutionist? Hypothetically, if I knew someone in their 40s, handsome, worked in radio, and thought about being a resolutionist one day, is that something you could plan for, Patti? Or do you have to sort of be closer to the age of the quote unquote resolutionist age?
No, I think it is absolutely something you can plan for. And like I said, having failed to plan for it at one point in my life, I really feel the difference between my first go round and this because of the planning. And I think one of the big elements of planning is to really have a conversation with yourself about what the triggers might be for you to embrace this life. And for everyone, it's different. In some cases, people are triggered by the accumulation of wealth. In other cases, people are triggered by their children have all left home. In other cases, people are triggered by a change in their company structure. So their company was just acquired by somebody and they don't want to go into the new thing. So I think thinking through what the triggers might look like for you, we've had friends that have been triggered by illness, parents' illness, or a spouse's illness, or their own illness, right? So I think being honest with yourself about what are the triggers that would make you seriously consider this, and then what are those elements that you want to be prepared for. And that's, like I said, it's about developing a new metric system for yourself. It's interesting, Joe, because I think most resolutionists, if you're going to fail at being a resolutionist, you do it very early, right? It's not something that you retire and then you fail it at 10 years later. It's that transition point that is really important, because the things that you had in your life that drove your confidence, and whether it's your office or your business card or your title or your entry into places because of what it is you do for a living, those go away. And so how do you continue to be confident about yourself? So really, one of the things we suggest people do is to develop their elevator pitch and have it ready. When you ask somebody like, oh, so Joe, tell me about yourself. The tendency is to say, well, I used to work in telecommunications and then I worked in, instead say, make your elevator pitch be only forward looking, right? So don't talk to me about what you did for 30 years, but talk to me about what you're doing. So maybe what you're doing is, I'm trying to watch every James Bond movie in chronological order. I'm Patti Hart and I'm watching every James Bond movie. I'm working in the soccer community to advance the sport for women. And I'm trying to hike a new hiking trail every week. And what happens when you do that is, now people are having conversations with you about what you're doing today, not what you did 30 years ago, which has an enormous impact on your confidence. If all you're talking about is what you did, what you're saying is, the best years are behind me, and they're really not. Getting these few little things ready to make that transition. I think it's like having a child, right? It's like, oh my gosh, you have a child, your whole life changes and you're forced to go through these change. In this case, you're not forced to go through it, you're choosing to go through it. So really having yourself ready, I think, is really important to break those habits, right? Of the kinds of things you have been doing and the kinds of places you've been spending your time. Really important.
Milledge, let me ask you a tough question here. Why do you think Patti failed the first time around? As, her partner and seeing things from the outside in, why do you think she failed the first time?
Joe, it's always a challenge to answer any question about why my partner failed. But here's my theory. I think that she wasn't mentally ready to move to the next phase. She had a lot more to give from a corporate perspective, and you could see that almost immediately. And so the reason why she left the first time was she sold the company where she was working. And while it felt like she had a lot of runway left, she found herself, through with that opportunity. And almost immediately she said, I'm going to start hiking more. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that. But none of which really resonated or gained traction with her. And each time a recruiter would call about a new company or a new board seat, you could see her get interested in it immediately. And so I would say she wasn't mentally prepared and wasn't ready. And also at the time, I was working more than full time. And when I was coming back at the end of the day or at the end of the business trip, she was, thirsty for more interaction and knowledge about the business world.
All right, Patti, you got to listen to what Milledge said. Was he right?
Yeah, I think he was right. I think, as I mentioned earlier, I hadn't really thought through the triggers. I thought, the world would tell me when it was time, instead of me being in control of that decision on my own, which is so outside of normal for me. I've been in control of every decision I've made in my life, it seems, along the way. And then for some reason, I had it in my mind that this wasn't a decision, but it was something that would happen to me. And so I wasn't really prepared. I didn't have a plan. I hadn't worked through the transition and making sure that in during that transition time, that I was paying attention to my own health and wellness, my confidence, my, engagement, my relevance, I just didn't do that. I thought this was, now a life of going on more hikes. And it isn't. It really is about finding your passion. And as Milledge said, teaching yourself to be your own best friend. I wasn't very good at that. I mean, I spent my whole career surrounded by people, traveling in, groups to meetings and going to these big festive sales offsites and this kind of thing. And now all of a sudden, I had a list of things and I was waiting to have someone to do them with. And, that wasn't going to work. I mean, if there were things I wanted to do, I needed to have the confidence, as I did in the business world, to tackle them on my own. Not always, but in many cases. So, I feel like maybe in that first time, Joe, I allowed myself to be a little bit of a victim of fate, like this is being done to me. And, I don't have anyone to do things with. And I just allowed that to happen, which I think is not unusual, honestly, when people get to this stage. A lot of people feel forced into this stage, right? With forced retirement ages in boardrooms and in certain organizations. And they kind of feel forced into the phase instead of saying, I'm doing this on my terms.
And so I want to talk about one of the aspects you mentioned about being a resolutionist earlier, and that's the philanthropic angle of it. Milledge, talk to me about that. Like, so if someone, I mean, that's probably could be a large part of someone's anti-retirement life is being involved in philanthropy. So how do you get people into that mindset who really either didn't have the time to do it while they were working or was not something that was top of mind?
Right. And I think that was the case for Patti and I, that we believed in philanthropy and we gave, but we didn't have the time to really commit to it during our working life. I agree with you for, I think, a number of resolutionists and a number of our resolutionist friends. This is a big part of how they are spending their time now and how they are giving back. And it's absolutely been the case for Patti and I. And I think it really goes to one of the points that we talk about in the book is, finding your passions. And both Patti and I were fortunate early in this next phase of our life to find a charitable organization or a charitable activity that met our passion and we were able to give back to and really use all of our resources, time, energy, effort to make better. So I think it's been a big part of ours, and I think it will continue to be a big part of our resolutionist life.
Yeah, and I think, Joe, it's a real shift from philanthropy. We all know that corporations are very involved in philanthropy. Most of mine were, most of Milledge's were, but this is different. This is really kind of an engaged giving, and not just giving and writing checks, but giving, right? I mean, I think, I didn't have time when I was working full time to volunteer to serve Meals on Wheels, right? I mean, this is something that happens at noon every day and not something I could have done. And I didn't have time to, go off on a mission trip to help build a house for Habitat for Humanity. I mean, so again, your biggest resource is your time and your experience. So it's really the application of that for good, for whatever your passion is, right? I mean, whether it's, we have people in our life who choose such a wide variety of philanthropic efforts, but this generation, this baby boomer growing to resolutionist generation, has the opportunity in mass to change the world like we've not changed it before. Whether you're going to go work at a polling station when people come to vote, or you're going to campaign door to door to get people registered to vote. There are so many things that you can do. And to your earlier question about financial resources, these are the things that they don't require financial resources. If you raise your hand and are willing to put in some elbow grease, people are going to welcome you.
And lastly, you guys have been working on this for, I guess, the last few years. And now all of a sudden we are dealing with a pandemic. So talk to me about how does someone become a resolutionist during these days of uncertain times? Is it something you guys have thought about including in the book, thought about in the movement? Walk me through that, Milledge.
Sure. A pandemic actually, at least from our perspective, seems like the perfect time to be able to focus on what your resolutions may be and how to make your life better and how to make the world's life better. With so many people being uncertain and, financially challenged and worried about health and things like that, we actually thought it was a great time to really focus on what we can do in our life to make other people's lives better and what we can do in our life to find what our passions are, spend more time, focused on learning and focused on how we help ourselves and the world get to a better place. So we think it's been a massively challenging time for everyone, but for a resolutionist, a great time to focus on what's next and how to make your and the world a better place.
Yeah, and I think during the COVID pandemic, and we do add a chapter at the end of our book about it because it was so poignant that we were writing this book in the middle of this pandemic. And it did change a lot of the way we thought about things. But I think it actually became a bit of a microcosm, Joe, of becoming a resolutionist. So this was a change that was forced upon us all. And people had to go through their own process for how to absorb it. And what Milledge and I found ourselves doing is going back to our resolutions and saying, okay, this is a transition that we didn't expect, but let's go back and lean on those same things that helped us transition from full-time work to this phase of our life and apply them. And we found it to be pretty remarkable. I mean, we've been more engaged in learning because, of course, you can take a university class at any university at any time via Zoom right now. So we thought, oh, this is the perfect time to get access to incredible learning that we don't have to get in a car or get on an airplane to access. This is a time when people need to come together, even if it's in Zoom, more than ever, right? Leaning on each other more than ever. So we actually thought it was a pretty ripe time to apply the same things that we used to transition to the, this shelter in place world.
And also during COVID, you get more of the most precious resource, which is time. If you don't have to commute, if you're not flying all over the world, if you're not running around and doing all these different things, you have more time to think, more time to focus, more time to plan, and more time to engage your passions.
Well, if you're ready to rip that Band-Aid off, look for the forthcoming book, The Resolutionist, Welcome to the Anti-Retirement Movement. They are Patti and Milledge Hart. Patti, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thanks, Joe.
And Milledge, always a pleasure talking to you. Hope all is well.
It was wonderful. Thanks.
You are quite welcome, and that's it for this edition of Forbes Books Radio, available for you to listen to and subscribe to on Apple, Spotify, Amazon, or wherever you get your podcasts. And please, don't forget the golden rule and treat others as you want to be treated. Thanks for listening. Until next time, adios.
This has been a production of Forbes Books Radio. Find out more at ForbesBooksRadio.com.